Well, with Football Manager 2025 indefinitely delayed, I've seen a bunch of people talk about trying out an MLS save. Now, trust me, I've been down this path before. In fact, I tried to warn you guys about this, but you simply won't listen. You know, I made that video almost a year ago. I think it's probably time for a little bit more of a deep dive. So let's go take a look and see how the MLS actually works, and let's see if we can't come up with at least a couple of tips for how to manage it in a Football Manager save. You know, for the crazy Football Manager players who actually want to give it a try. Okay, first things first, we need to understand why the structure of the league is what it is. Like other American and Canadian sports leagues, the MLS is actually a legal monopoly. It is a league that deliberately limits the number of clubs and runs by extremely strict salary rules. This is what I call the National League system. Its origins can be traced back to baseball's National League, which was formed in 1875. The National League divided up the United States between different franchises, giving each club its own territorial monopoly. All of this probably sounds really anti-free market to you, and that's because it is anti-free market. In fact, this is a Gilded Age era policy that literally comes straight out of the Gilded Age, the 1870s. And yet, the odd thing is that most Americans and Canadians can't really conceive of sports being organized any other way. When you look at a map of where MLS teams are located, you can see this territorial concept at work. You'll also see similar trends when you look at homegrown player territories, which is another concept that is unique to the MLS and will seem foreign to most of you. Now, it's really important to understand this monopolistic system. The reason why this is important is because the ridiculous salary structure of Major League Soccer would not be possible without it. Okay, when you first start your MLS save, you'll get this message from your assistant manager. This should be enough for you to restart the save and choose a normal league, but let's say that you want to torture yourself. Well, when you start digging in, you'll see that things are actually as clear as mud. You've got a ton of different hoops to jump through before your team can actually compete in the league. It works like this. You've got a 30-man roster, and honestly, you care the most about 20 of those 30 slots. Those 20 slots are your senior roster. And the wages you can pay to players on that senior roster are strictly governed by a salary cap. This is a cap that you cannot go over. Well, in theory, you can't go over the cap. But as many of you probably already know, you actually can go over the salary cap. You can have up to 3 of what they call designated players on your team, and the designated player salaries only count against your cap to a certain level. And then you've got general allocation money and target allocation money, which are both Mickey Mouse imaginary currencies that let you buy down the salary cap hit. So let's handle these 3 things one at a time. Okay, first we'll talk about the designated player rule, also known as the Beckham rule, for obvious reasons. You can have up to 3 of these designated players. They'll only cost you the maximum salary, even if their real salary is above that. And the slot is basically designed for expensive big-name foreign stars like Beckham. Well, the big question, of course, is why in the world the league would bother with a salary cap if it's just going to break its own rules anyway. And this is kind of where things become interesting. Some of you might remember that Brazilian legend Pelé signed for the New York Cosmos back in 1975. Pelé was the first of several huge names to sign for the Cosmos. The theory back then was that these players would make the struggling North American Soccer League, or NASL, seem more legitimate. The other theory was that a huge name like this would generate interest in the sport in the United States, and I guess you could argue that that worked. If you read the original newspaper articles, the reasoning becomes obvious. Pelé was supposed to be an ambassador for the sport in the United States. Now, the crazy thing is that articles about David Beckham over 30 years later predicted that Beckham would do the exact same thing. So it turns out that signing a bunch of aging star foreign players to ridiculously high salaries doesn't really help the sport grow domestically. And, you know, we've seen that in other countries, in China, for example. And right now, you could argue that we're seeing the same thing happen in Saudi Arabia. Now, this should make you wonder why the MLS even bothers with the designated player rule in the first place. Okay, now comes the other complicated part, general allocation money and target allocation money. These funds also reduce the power of the salary cap. General allocation money is given to each team based on a whole bunch of different criteria, including where they finished the season before, whether they made the playoffs, whether they were an expansion team, and so on. Every team gets a different amount. So I'll simplify this a bit. General allocation money basically exists to help teams pay down salaries to get under the salary cap. Target allocation money is pretty much the same thing. The only difference is that you can carry target allocation money over to the next season, but you cannot do that with general allocation money. So to put this simply, Major League Soccer has one of the most restrictive salary caps in all of sports. And then, in the name of parity or competition, it creates 3 major exceptions to allow its teams to overcome the salary cap. So why even mess with the salary cap? Now, the thing is that if you're a Football Manager veteran, you'll realize pretty quickly that you can actually exploit this system. Well, don't freak out when you see messages like this one. There's actually very little incentive for you to spend any of your general allocation money or target allocation money. The interesting thing about both of these currencies is that you can use them to trade for players, and interestingly enough, the computer manager really overestimates how valuable they really are. That's right, trading players. You see, in Major League Soccer, just like in the other American sports, all players basically have a contract with the league, not with each individual team. And so, as is the case in other American sports, you wind up trading the rights to players around with other teams instead of buying those rights and then negotiating new contracts with them. And this also means, of course, that MLS has a waiver system, which is another peculiarity of American sports. Waivers, that's another 19th century concept. Now, I found newspaper articles about baseball waivers going back to 1905, though I know that the practice goes back to the 1880s at least. The idea behind waivers is that any team that wants to break the contract a certain player has with the league, let's say by demoting the player to a reserve squad, needs to check first with every other team in the league. The other teams could then buy this player for a nominal fee, which is usually way under the market value. Due in large part to collusion, American team owners have historically shied away from meeting that waiver price. But of course, things are a little bit different these days. Now, if you're managing the MLS in Football Manager, you really need to keep the waivers in mind. Okay, make sure that you keep a few roster slots open. At the end of the first transfer window, you'll always see the computer manager waive good players. This is because Football Manager's computer logic cannot wrap its head around the waiver system. If you're patient, though, you can get some incredible players for very cheap because the computer manager will forget how to register them. Well, that's my number 1 advice for MLS saves. So first of all, of course, don't be scared to get rid of the stupid in-game Mickey Mouse currency, since it really doesn't mean anything. But the big thing is to make sure that you always have roster spots available for waiver deals. Remember those 2 things, and you'll win the league your first season. There's some other stuff that I really should mention. One thing is that the draft is generally a waste of time. I just let the computer do it for me. Youth intakes are interesting, but you don't have a great pipeline to get young players up to your big club. As is the case in real life, the MLS and Football Manager makes any sort of youth management a pain. Again, the best strategy is to focus on getting good players for cheap in waivers and to trade your Mickey Mouse money away to get the best players in the league. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about whether this ridiculous system actually solves any of the problems that the NASL had. And from the way I'm talking about this, you can probably guess what my answer is. The NASL's moment in the sun really only lasted about 2 or 3 years in the late 1970s. The NASL was known mostly for the ridiculous number of talented players from Europe and South America that it lured over to the United States. There are people who think that the demise of the league came because of the foreign players and their high salaries. And that, keeping salaries down, is really the main reason for the restrictive salary cap. It's a monopoly, yeah, but it's really a monopoly that is designed to keep player salaries down more than do anything else. And the funny thing is that these designated players and the Mickey Mouse money ends up invalidating the whole theory. I mean, the truth is that the MLS is doing exactly what the NASL did. It's signing aging superstars to crazy contracts. Well, there are 2 other major reasons why the NASL failed. One impacts the MLS, the other one doesn't. First, the one that does not impact the MLS was competition from other leagues. You see, the NASL was in direct competition with the major indoor soccer league from the middle of the 1970s until it fell apart. The major indoor soccer league really needs a few videos to itself. It was basically hockey on artificial turf that was played with a soccer ball. It was also very popular at its height and wound up going after NASL players, which is what caused the salaries to rise back in those days. Major League Soccer doesn't really have a competitor like this. The MISL actually outlasted the NASL and became the biggest soccer league in America until it folded in the early 1990s. Now, the second factor, the one that does impact the MLS, is expansion. NASL teams made money by agreeing to expand the league to new cities, despite the fact that many existing teams were facing bankruptcy. So for example, this is what the NASL looked like in 1977. And this is what it looked like in 1978. The league added 6 new teams that year, but average attendance actually dropped. The spending caught up with the league pretty quickly. By 1981, most of those teams simply no longer existed, and there was no more national television contract on top of that. There are some people who believe that the MLS is avoiding that overexpansion plague, but I'm honestly not convinced. But at least we can say that the MLS has a television contract, which is already much better than the NASL. Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens with this league in the long term. When it comes to Football Manager, though, you don't have to worry too much about all of the backroom economics. Just remember to keep some slots open for waiver players, remember to skip the stupid draft, and remember also to trade away all of your Mickey Mouse money, and you'll figure out a way to win.